right into it. Cecily, thank you so much for joining. You've had an amazing career. I cannot wait. I got your notes back from the doc. I think this is going to be an amazing conversation. So thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
Awesome. So you've had an amazing career. You're currently advising a couple of companies while working with ConsenSys as a venture partner. You're previously with Flipboard as a chief business and legal officer. Could you just I wanted to kind of give you just a minute or so just to tell us a bit about yourself, your background, and how you approach building companies with venture capital.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it's like to be here. I love speaking with people about my own journey and sharing some experiences and insights that are hopefully helpful to others as they progress. I've had a unique one. My career so far has been really about following my interests, my passions, and developing relationships along the way. And I started that in a formal sense by going to law school in 1998. The intention there was really to learn the language of the enemy. I was always very attracted to young and innovative ideas and technology and arts and everything within creative spaces, including some in the health and kind of alternative fields. And I kept on bumping into problems that arose in connection with the law and compliance and regulation. And so I thought I would go to law school and just at least figure out how the legal system works. I ended up really enjoying. Yeah, it's great. I often told people I wanted to be the sheep in wolf's clothing as opposed to the more commonly known one. So I surprisingly really enjoyed law school. I had been taking a couple of years off after undergrad, and being back in the routine was fantastic. I love the rigor and everything above. And spent 3 years at a law firm, which I also surprisingly really enjoyed, and then was attracted to and took a role with Listen.com, which is a music startup, which was to thank for creating the Rhapsody service, one of the first music subscription services.
I mean, music totally makes sense to someone who needs a lawyer. So that makes a ton of sense.
Of course. So, but we were really trying to follow in the footsteps of what Napster had done illegally, but offer a legal and legitimate option that would hopefully have a better outcome for artists and all the other creatives around recorded content. I spent 7 years with Rhapsody through 3 different companies. So there was the original Listen.com acquired by Real Networks. Then we did a joint venture with Viacom and merged with their MTVN project, and took their subscribers, grew bigger, did all the things, and then we spun out into our own independent company in 2010. And that was my first experience with startups, my first experience with being part of a small team trying to build something. We were really, even though we were starting with an established product and some backing, it felt very much like a founding team. And we had a lot of fun choosing branding and offices and thinking about the culture that we wanted to define and how much capital we wanted to have and where our dependencies were going to be. And I did this as a lawyer with them for a while. And then it was a ride.
What was the size of the company? That sounds like you went from 10 people to what was the biggest that the company went to? It sounds like that was a really interesting company scaling piece that you had to navigate as well.
Yeah, we were shrinking and growing in a couple of cycles over that 7-year period. When I joined Listen.com, it had been, I think, a couple hundred people that had been acquired by Real Networks, which is a company of well over 1,000 and a public company. So my first day on the job, I was employed by the Seattle-based Publico. And then when we did the joint venture, we became significantly smaller. I think we were in the 200 to 300 range. And then we shrunk a little bit even further in our efforts to control costs, as startups do. Mm-hmm. And then when we spun out, we were particularly controlled with our headcount, and then growing very carefully from there. We did expand internationally during that period. We had a headquarters in Europe as well as in the US, and we had some strategic partnerships that took us abroad and helped us expand the reach of the service. So we went from a high of probably 12 to 1,500 to a low of just under 200 with a couple of bounces in between.
That sounds like So much to learn. Like,
Yeah,
sounds
it was a
fascinating.
ride. It was a ride. So anyway, I did that, and then I was actually on my way into a role with Google in 2012. I had met with a former boss of mine who'd gone on to be the general counsel for this rinky-dink little startup down the road called YouTube, and she had since helped to navigate that acquisition by Google and was part of the Android team, and I was considering joining that group. Um, and very quickly, in that very short process of getting from conversation to interviews to negotiations and references, I had somebody who I really trust call me up and say, you know, I got the call from Google. I'm very happy to be an excellent reference for you. I can highly recommend you for the role, but I want to tell you, you're going to be miserable there. You've now had a taste of startup life, and you've been in the trenches with the team, having to wear multiple hats at a time. And if you join the 2,000 plus human Google legal team, you're going to be in a division and a division and a division and doing a lot of the same thing every day. And as a friend, I have to encourage you to try something else. And long story short, I ended up meeting Mike McHugh and the other founders and leaders, builders at the Flipboard team down in Palo Alto. And after a number of very inspiring conversations, joined them in, I believe it was August, September of 2012. And went in as the first legal counsel. Quickly also was overseeing, not by my own interests, but just responding to a need and an ask from Mike, the people and talent team, also supporting some operations and finance and other areas within the company. I also did a couple plus years as chief revenue officer, which was a primarily operations role. And then also really just did the heavy lifting that we did between our Series B and post D in investor relations and all the compliance work and publisher relations, and got my first taste of fundraising in that period as well.
That was my next question, was like, did you have a lot of experience at the Rhapsody part within pitching, or did you really like kind of hone your, I guess, like the philosophy behind how you pitch? You honed that at Flipboard then?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I think pitching is in a lot of ways an art form that applies to a whole myriad of contexts and industries. I mean, without stretching at all, when we were working to negotiate our long-term record deals with the majors and the publishing bodies around the world to give us licenses and permissions to distribute heavily protected, highly valuable copyrighted content through our digital platform, we were really pitching our service. We were conveying a problem with an opportunity and a revenue opportunity. And we really, in many cases, had to convince folks who had been thinking in an analog way that taking this digital journey with us was worthwhile and not so risky that they shouldn't give it a shot. And it turns out that that's actually a lot of what venture pitching is as well. Though I did not get any of that direct experience until I went to Flipboard. In fact, that was one of the more terrifying features of my early months and years with the company, because Flipboard is a venture-backed startup. And while I came into a growing team with strong capital and emerging revenue, we wanted to raise $100 million fairly quickly after I joined. And I was the only in-house lawyer. And we weren't being led through the process by a banker. It was a couple of us and me managing all the diligence and putting the decks together and meeting with these remarkable investors and telling the story of Flipboard. And Mike McHugh is a true serial entrepreneur. He's had a number of very successful ventures and a few exits in his life, and he is a gifted storyteller. And he also is a very high EQ human being who quickly connects with people and can communicate the vision of his company and product. And so I had an opportunity to be in room for those conversations over years and a couple of really critical cycles of fundraising, 100 million Series C and then the 50 million Series D later. And then all of the quarterly board meetings with our board where we were communicating our strategy and our plan and how we were executing against our plan and what we were expecting to need going forward support-wise. And so it was really remarkable hands-on training in that I was able to just witness how this worked and where things were challenging and where the opportunities popped up and what made some people more comfortable or nervous or what materials were supportive in that process. And I was fascinated by it from the very start.
That sounds amazing. And one of the things that sort of jumped out at me when you were describing this, and I'm curious to get your take on it, is it sounds like you're trying to really quickly communicate both the opportunity that exists within the space and also build trust between the two parties. Like both, like that sort of happens within negotiations. That also seems to kind of be happening within pitching. Is that accurate? Do you see that as kind of an accurate way? Like how do you think about like kind of establishing that trust with either the audience or the other party?
Well, it's a great point to actually drill in on, because I think that that is one of the most essential and often overlooked ingredients to an investor startup relationship. From the very first communication, really in any relationship, but especially in this one, both bodies, people are following signals and assessing the trustworthiness of the other. And that could be mundane, kind of black and white things like, do they bloat their numbers when they're talking? Do they speak ill of the other investor that they met with last week? Are they radically honest with regard to the mistakes that they made last year that resulted in their missing their plan by 20% or whatever it might be? Those are really important things that come through and can start to be picked up on in a first email communication, or even in some cases more now, an in-person introduction or a LinkedIn outreach. People are trying to assess trustworthiness right from the start. And so I think it's really important to encourage founders with whom I meet pretty regularly to be very mindful of what they say and how they say it. Never disparage anybody else. Don't bloat your numbers. Don't do anything that would signal that you are not of integrity. And frankly, if you're not of integrity going into it, you probably shouldn't be working with me or these investors anyway. Surprising that you're out getting this far. So I think that's really, really important. And there are different ways to do that. I worked recently with a startup where the CEO founder, even though he's quite accomplished, is remarkably self-deprecating. You have to draw the success numbers out of him. You will not get him in the first 5 or 10 minutes talking about the fact that his outrageous quarter over quarter growth over the last 3 years in a very difficult to crack industry has been 100% organic. It was after 5 coaching sessions with him where this came up. And I had to say, hey, this is something that goes right at the beginning of your deck and right at the beginning of your conversation when you're talking about your traction. So it's fun to see how that evolves. Everybody's very different in that regard.
That is so fascinating. I feel like I work with a ton of early stage, like I would say like pre-idea, like pre-funding, definitely pre-idea a lot of times, type of builders. And I feel like like what you're saying, like don't inflate the numbers, I think is such an interesting point, because a lot of times I think the people who are building tend to be incredibly enthusiastic and passionate about their ideas. And I think the first step with that, and something that I, as someone who works on things as well, right? Like I'm trying to like accurately assess the potential and the traction of everything. I think the first step is to like be honest with yourself in a lot of ways. Like you have to first be honest with yourself so that you can be honest with others, that like the traction that you're actually observing is actual traction, right? Like it is actual like positive signal towards the market, and that it is something that you can actually like kind of like take advantage of and should continue to pursue. So I think that's such a fascinating observation on your end, and also like a really good something I'm going to continue to work to internalize, and I'm going to encourage everyone else to as well. I love that. So just to like, so I think we're going to jump straight into like our guide, because we went a little bit off. I apologize for throwing you a curveball.
Oh, it's all good. Love it.
Like it was too interesting to skip. So something I'm particularly keen to discuss with you is kind of the why of pitching. So like so many teams I talk to, even myself time to time falls into this trap of pitching as a necessary evil, right? That's a problem, I'm assuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a problem. I actually typically coach founders and those doing the pitching to recognize this process, this component of building a company as a real opportunity. Pitching sounds like uncomfortable, speaking in front of strangers, asking for money, having to articulate the value and intrigue of your company or product before a room, not knowing how people really feel about you or if they're judging you, having to really sell yourself. And a lot of today's startups and founders are really the creatives and the visionaries who are invested in the product and spending their time thinking about solving real life problems for the people at the end of the chain of the development, not having to sell the vision to somebody who might put money into it to make it possible. And I think that that's a real shame, because there is this great chance to use the pitching experience and all the preparation that goes into it as an opportunity to really tune your vision. Get clear on what you are doing, why you are doing it, how you're going to do it, and who and what you need on the bus for this journey. I, for example, also in the last couple of weeks, have been working with a really remarkable, very successful company in the blockchain space, actually. And they are so heads down on their very successful project that they really were loath to be spending time developing a deck and doing dry runs. I mean, I am helping them do out loud rehearsals of their pitch in preparation for a series of meetings where they're asking for a lot of money from some very remarkable and reputable investors. And it got to a point a couple weeks ago where we said, not only are we going to be looking at decks on Google Docs and, kind of experimenting with what the materials and tone looks like, but we're actually going to meet almost daily by Zoom. And we're going to talk through the existential nature of your company. Why are you here? What are you doing? Why do you care so much about this? And why should an investor care about it? And through that process, we've actually been on a bit of a journey together where they're realizing, I think maybe in a way more than they did before starting the process, that they are really empowering some of the most remarkable corporations in the world to do what they do better and faster, which is inspiring them at another level. So they wouldn't have actually seen that or done the work to really drill into the essence of why they're working so hard in the first place had they not had this kind of deadline to get a pitch together, get a deck together. So I really, really very quickly try to talk people out of thinking about it as just a big pain in the butt and something that they have to do, and instead welcome them into this process that is going to change the nature of how they view themselves, and ideally, if they're successful, the amount of runway and capital they have to really excel at developing and bringing their vision to life. And if they see it as this kind of arc of a journey, it can actually be very fun despite the hard work.
That's so interesting. And I think something that it just makes me think of is essentially people. I love how you're framing it as a story. You're essentially telling a story, right? People love to tell their story, or most people do anyway, unless you're extremely introverted. I'm extremely introverted, so I tend to try to shy away from that. But even then, people ask me about what I'm passionate about or what I'm building. That's a big deal, and I kind of love that idea of, instead of thinking of it as like a transactional piece, thinking of it as getting to fashion and hone the why as far as like what you're doing.
Yeah,
I love that. Is there, are there like different stages essentially, or sorry, like, are there different types of stories that you should be telling based off of the stage that your company is in? So like, like pre-funding to seed to Series A, et cetera, or is it kind of all within the same sort of story?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the preparation process, kind of following some of the same terminology I was just using, I think it's really important to get crisp on the what. What are you doing? What do you need to do more, better, faster? What is the problem you're solving? What is the market that you're focusing on? Get really clear on kind of the nuts and bolts of what has brought you to this place at the outset. And that could take a period of time. And sometimes startups and founding teams are pretty clear on that from the beginning. Sometimes it requires more work. And then a little bit later on in the process, at least in this particular fundraising journey, I tend to encourage folks to think about the why. You're actually now kind of heavily midpoint in this process, and you're needing to really capture the hearts and minds and imaginations and conviction, frankly, of an investor for why they want to be on this journey with you. Why should they take money that could go into one project and instead put it into yours? What are they going to get out of it? Why is this industry interesting? Why do we believe it's growing? Why are these customers jumping on the bus? You want to really get to the essence of why and help an investor feel themselves or recognize in a very data-backed way that this is something smart for them to do at this moment. And timing is also really, really key. Another thing that I think investors expect, which is a little bit later on in the process, and extending the same terminology, is the how. While they want to invest in teams that are evidently quite competent and capable and have some type of a track record, they're also going to want to get clear on and understand how is a team going to deploy and use those resources? How are they going to use this money? And it's funny how few startups actually hesitate to answer this question until after they've raised the money. They think, well, we'll get the money and then we'll think about how we're going to use it. That doesn't work. Nobody is going to extend, in many cases, millions of dollars and not understand how it's going to be used and how they're going to measure their success as it is being used. So a team needs to know, what are their KPIs? What are the key priority hires? How are you going to measure success? At what frequency? How are you going to hire those key hires? What is your team going to look like 12 months from close of this raise? And how are you going to position yourself to stay on this scaling and growth trajectory in a way that will position you at the right timing for your next event, whether that is coming to a place where you're cash flow positive or another fundraising process. So sometimes that type of a terminology supports in the staging, but by the end of the preparation and the pitch process, it's really important that a team be able to speak with conviction and clarity and, frankly, some succinctness around the value of what they're building, what they want to do with the money, and how an investor can be a participant in their success.
That's fascinating. The succinctness, I think, is especially difficult, I would say, for a lot of people.
And they're important questions to ask. I think sometimes companies tend to get a little bit stuck and in their own way. They don't pause enough to ask these questions. I've actually seen situations where, because a company is doing really well and they're having this remarkable growth, they don't pause and think through some of these items, or maybe they don't have a board that's holding them accountable at the same time, or investors that are asking good questions as they go. And then when they come to a point where they do need to actually articulate some of this, they're stuck a little bit on their heels, and you never want to be in that place. Over time, ideally, a startup evolves from being venture-backed dependent into on its own feet and generating its own revenue and being able to return some of that value back to investors. They're having this kind of self-review on a regular cyclical basis in a way that is both all the way up at the very top on an annual review type business plan or business model plan oriented way, all the way down to every single human being within the company, thinking about how what they do every day is contributing to the greater vision and mission.
That's great. And you're saying, just to kind of, I want to make sure I understand, you're saying the annual review kind of at the C level point. What, I guess like what is, that's a, are there like, is there sort of a cadence that you think is smart, especially when the team is kind of small? Is there a cadence as
Mhm.
far as kind of realigning around those core goals, the core trajectory, the core, I guess, story that you're kind of telling as a company? Is there a cadence that makes sense, or is the team just kind of naturally doing that because they're so small?
Well, if there aren't market or team or other external factors that are forcing the self-review, or God forbid we use the word pivot of some kind, um, I think that the most typical cycle and cadence is an annual one. And I really love seeing just a calendar annual cadence for startups. Now, the devil is in the detail on that. That doesn't mean you start the new year and everybody comes back from the holidays and you have an offsite or spend a day around the conference room and you brainstorm around what you want to do that year. I am a major advocate for starting January 1, every single person in the company already knowing what they're doing that year and why, and how they're going to measure their success along the way. So if you're going to start the new year clear on what you're doing in that new year, those meetings are actually happening now. They're happening in the Q3, Q4 timeframe, and the team is looking at external factors as well as internal factors. What is the market demanding? Where are we positioned to particularly excel or compete or win? What do we have going for us that maybe others in the market do not? What are our resource constraints or opportunities? What are the strategic partnerships that we have been able to or might be able to strike? Excuse me. And from there, I think it's possible to say, well, I like a 3 to 5, no more than 3 or 5, but a list of a few things that are going to be the primary objectives going into the new year, and help kind of tune that down to an individual level so that when the new year starts, you're already on your feet. You're not thinking about going from walk, crawl, run. You're already in full movement and you know what you're doing, you know why, and you know that towards the end of each quarter in that last 30 days or so, you're going to be pausing and looking back and making sure that you're pacing against your goals.
I love that. I mean, it's essentially keeping like a holistic narrative, right? Like through the entire year, as opposed to kind of an arbitrary date. People like they tend to criticize New Year's resolutions, right? Because it's like
Mm.
January 1st, like what makes this day more likely that your habit are going to stick. And it's kind of the same way within business. If you're not doing the work on Q3 and Q4 of like analyzing the trajectory, like analyzing what you're doing, then why start on Jan 1 at that point? So
Yeah.
that totally makes sense.
I also think it's important to be willing to adapt. That doesn't mean you throw in the towel on your goals if you're running behind schedule. It might mean having a real careful look at how your spending is going against your revenue. And if you had a plan to hire 15 engineers in Q4, but you're coming up 20% short on your revenue plan, maybe you adjust your investment accordingly, or vice versa. Maybe you have a product that's just crushing it in market unexpectedly and you have more demand that you can fulfill. It probably makes sense to do what you need to do to resource accordingly and maybe spend a little bit more to achieve a bit more. And I think there are both advantages and disadvantages to revisiting plans and goals at different points throughout the year. In most startups, at least the ones that I'm working with, things are moving pretty quickly, and 12 months is an eternity. You cannot know what's happening within your company or within your market 11 months from now. So it's good to have a midpoint check-in and say, okay, are things running along the way that we expected internally and externally? Should we revisit some of these to make sure that we're staying within the right realm of reach and goal setting and achievability and inspiration for the people who are doing all the work to make it so? Sometimes that means changing things up or down.
Nice. Okay. And to stay within the theme of pivoting
Mm-hmm.
of that, I'm going to pivot the conversation a little bit to
Yeah.
like kind of start talking a little bit more about tactics, which is like how do you start building a pitch?
Mm-hmm. That's a good one. Most of the time, startup, by the time I meet them, in my experience, they already have a deck of some kind. It might be something that they're using for partnership discussions, or it's one that they used the last time that they were doing fundraising. There's usually something, and I like to give them an opportunity to kind of do the walkthrough and not really say much or react very much. You know, get a look at where people are starting. So if you're out there and you're a founder, you're part of a leadership team of a startup, and you're thinking about getting ready to do a raise, take a little bit of time, pull together the materials that you would use to articulate the purpose of and the vision for and the trajectory of your company and why you're building it. Go back to that why, what, and how. Sometimes you'll end up with something pretty evolved and mature. Sometimes you really don't have very much to work with and you can start at square one. Either way, once those kind of basic pieces are pulled together, I then typically suggest that we don't try to break the mold and try to deliver a pitch in a way that is backed by materials that follow some variation on a formula that is relatively consistent and predictable. So I even just this morning was actually in a meeting with a startup that was doing a dry run with an investor, and it was an hour-long pitch, and they went through their deck, and I heard this investor who's just giving them their very wanted, brutal, direct, immediate feedback, kind of cite the same formula. Like, this is how you want to do it. This is what you want to say. So the formula is as follows, and again, this can be adapted in a way to suit the particular product, team, company, market need, timing, stage, etc. But I typically think it's important to start with just the vision. Some companies this doesn't work, but there's usually something that can, in a sentence, articulate what the company is aspiring to do and the vision for its existence. What is the outcome? What is the net, the big picture of this effort? And then from there, you need to very clearly articulate the problem. Companies and products are usually solving a problem. So what is the problem? It could be that this big body of work is incredibly inefficient, or it's very difficult to find a place to stay in a foreign city that's not a hotel, or I'm not finding great tools as a startup advisor and I need something that can help me track XYZ. You know, state what the problem is and then go through what the solution is. So that would be the next part, following the problem. What is this company doing to solve for that problem? Sometimes this is framed as the opportunity. What is the chance that this company has to address that problem in a way that's going to be compelling and generate engagement or revenue in whatever form that is? Then I really like how it works. I think particularly in tech companies, we tend to assume that people understand how products work. This happens particularly within blockchain, and that's a mistake. I think it's good to kind of bring it down to very basic. This investor this morning told this team, investors are just a bunch of monkeys. They don't understand anything, and you need to, without making them feel like you're dumbing down your talk to them, really significantly dumb down to the most simple building blocks possible, what it is you're doing and how your product works, and show them, often with graphics, diagram, whatever it might be. I often then like to see traction. How are you doing so far? And the most important thing in traction is to show that there is some adoption, there is some growth. People are interested, companies, whoever it might be, are actually adopting this solution for this problem, and they're using it, and they're doing that more and more. And that's typically in a graph, and you can do this often on one slide.
Mm-hmm. Is that how you, I don't mean to interrupt, but is that how you define traction? Which is essentially people are adopting this solution to solve the problem that we defined in the previous slide?
That's the most common that I see, and the most common that I work with right now.
Nice. I
So
really like that definition. I
yeah,
think people ask me what traction is. I have like a 5-paragraph summary. So I think I may adopt that and then just try to attribute it to you
please.
because I think that's a great summary of what traction is.
That's great. No attribution needed. We're all trying to solve these problems together, right? So yeah, so it's really showing that there's some up and to the right. There's some growth. I like to also, depending on the company, again, this is adaptable, see how a project or a team is comparable to what else is in the market. So if you have a legitimate problem and you're building a solution, there are probably others building a similar solution to the same problem. And I think startups sometimes fall in this trap of thinking if somebody else is already trying to solve this problem, forget about it. Let's try to find some other cool company to develop or product to build. That's a mistake because a sight into others trying to solve the same problem is actually a validation that it's a real problem. And you're not the only ones who have recognized it and decided to invest time and money and blood and sweat and tears into solving it. So first get over that hump and then do your research if you haven't already and figure out who's out there. Figure out what distinguishes them from you. Are they, by territory, by solution set, by platform availability, by product offering, by, pricing, whatever it might be. And these are very common slides you can see in almost any pitch deck. Put your company and how you're doing and how you compare against your competition. That does a couple things. First of all, it should give you an opportunity to demonstrate why you're the investable and proven and desirable premier solution. Second, and this is maybe even more important than the first, it shows an investor that you are aware of what is out there and that it is not stopping you, and you're not going to be caught surprised when they mention in a meeting, so, big so-and-so investor down the road just invested in a company that's doing exactly what you're doing, but XYZ. Your answer can very easily flow, well, but they don't have these three things, and they're focusing on this one market. We have this diversity, or vice versa. They're trying to solve this major problem for the entire world. We're focusing on this key vertical or demo, or our pricing is different, whatever it might be. So that in and of itself, going back to your first question, could actually serve the dual purpose of building confidence and trust, as well as just helping you to compare yourself and see how you line up against what else is in the market. Super important. I also like to see timeline. Investors just curious, what's the history? How long have you been doing this? Some startups, one that I worked with just a couple of years ago, had actually been building for 7 years before they had a full pivot of their product and started doing the next thing. And then within 3 years, they were acquired by a public company. That happens more often than people realize. But showing that history and that they had the learnings and the ability to generate some revenue and become independent through that initial 7-year period, before then they had a kind of a strategy shift and accelerate their growth and their hiring and their value, and then end in an acquisition. That was a really important journey that they were on that told the entirety of the history of the company. And when they were raising some final capital at the very end for a specific purpose, it was very confidence inspiring. Similarly, in this meeting I was in this morning, the team has only been building actually for a couple of years, and they've released dozens of products or tweaks or offerings. And that type of execution pacing is pretty exciting to an investor, assuming that the quality is good and the solutions are solving real problems and they're staying ahead of the curve of demand. That's super interesting. So then again, it's another one of these, maybe not right for every startup. Some are so early stage that you don't actually have much of a timeline yet. Like, we met in college, we had an idea, here's our idea. Okay, that's fine. That's okay too. Don't feel like you have to hack together a timeline, but it is something that's useful for some that have had a product to market for a while. And then when you do so, you want to show some forward as well. For the people who don't quite have a product in market yet, and you are in that very early stage, sometimes the timeline can be useful. to map out what you see coming over the next 12 to 24 months. You could do a forward-facing timeline, but acknowledge that there's some risk in that because inevitably there are going to be some demand and resource dependencies. And then finally, investors really want to know who's on your team, who's doing this. That in some cases is among the most important things they want to learn during a pitch. So a simple slide, who are you? Why should they trust you? Why should they have confidence in you as the people behind this idea, this project? And you should have enough detail about what gives you the credibility to actually be trusted with their money to do what you say you're going to do. Again, back to trust.
Is there sort of like an easy way to think about talking about the team or talking about yourself in a way that like gets the investors what they want to know and doesn't necessarily feel like sort of manufactured and sort of like, you know, kind of like fronting, I guess, for lack of a better word?
I think this is actually one area where you really only have to be authentic. And sometimes just the facts is good enough.
Right.
And for most, that's going to be, this is my background. This is, 2 or 3 things I've done. And this is why I'm really passionate about this project and or company or product or whatever it might be. And sometimes you can ask people to help each other out in this regard too. I've seen team members ask each other to write each other's brief blurb or bio for them.
I love that.
And
I've done that on a couple of presentations, and it helps so much.
Yeah, it is actually very helpful. I hosted a dinner, an invite-only kind of special industry dinner every year or so, and I try to reserve a table for 12 in a private room in a restaurant in San Francisco, and it's always this great like 4-hour, super powered, amazing people dinner. And after the 15 or 20 minutes of everybody having a drink and sitting down and getting ready for the meal, I open the dinner and I say, instead of going around the room and having everybody introduce themselves, everybody at the table pick somebody else at the table and introduce them. And by the end of it usually ends up going on for well over an hour, because people love to kind of extend praise and recognition to other accomplished people that they know. And usually fun stories will come out of that. And I found that people have discovered a bit about what makes them a remarkable human just by hearing somebody else speak of them. So if you're struggling to come up with your 4 to 6 line blurb of who you are and why you're special, ask your co-founder or former employee or boss to take 5 minutes to do it for you and see what you come up with. It might be something that's actually going to be very helpful in helping you to articulate what makes you unique or valuable in a pitch.
That's really helpful. I really like that strategy. At the dinner, had they met before? And so were they trying to formulate that after like a couple of hours of conversation, or did they have a pre-existing relationship?
This is actually, it's a very specific network of people that have a professional thread in common. So never do all 12 of the people already know each other. I would say at least 3 to 4, 5, 6, 7 are meeting for the first time that evening. But because of the nature of the network, there are almost always enough threads to connect. And people are mindful of, oh, I know I'm the only person who knows that person because I helped them get to this dinner table.
Right.
I'm going to be the one to introduce them, and we softball it and help them out. But
that's so cool. All right, I was so curious as to like how quickly they were kind of generating that biography of that person in their head. So that's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah,
all right. So is there an 80-20 to pitching? Like, is there a way to keep the most important thing when constructing your pitch?
I think that yes, that's actually a good question, and it's one that warrants a minute or two of reminder. I think that founders, particularly product-oriented founders or technical founders, can spend 80% of their time thinking about the magnificence of a product and an opportunity and the sequencing of the journey, the team, and deriving these solutions and how things have evolved, and they can really get into the beauty and the art. And then they kind of leave for the last staging of the pitch development the important things like, what does the revenue look like, or what is the revenue strategy? How are you going to grow? And what exactly are the products that you're going to be releasing and when? And in many cases, what are your KPIs, your key performance indicators going to be? I think that for an investor, sometimes the 80 is that they want you to get to that right at the beginning. How are you going to make money? How am I going to benefit from the money that you're making? And how are you going to measure yourself along your journey? And that can be a little bit jarring and off-putting for founding teams who are more mission driven, but it's an essential ingredient. And so again, it's very situation and company dependent, but I would say that remembering who you're speaking to and why they're giving you their time, and then orienting your conversation around that is really, really important. If you have spent 15 or 20 minutes on a pitch and you haven't talked about revenue yet, you've already pissed somebody off. So I would make sure that you're ready to speak to that pretty quickly.
So it's basically remember your audience and what they need to know, and keep that the most important.
Yes, and this kind of gets into the overall EQ, the emotional intelligence behind pitching, and why I really encourage people to do it in person and in a room together. Try to avoid dialing in or zooming into pitches whenever possible. And then once you're in a room giving a pitch, realize, first of all, have your pitch so down and so clear that you don't need to be mental about what's coming out of your mouth during the pitch, right? So practice it a lot. But once you're in there, you're actually in a field of information. And it's your job to be studying the room and adapting your message and your pitch in a way to map your scenario, your audience, and your timeline. One really common thing I see is investor comes into the room, the conference room where the team is waiting, and the investor comes in, 5 or 10 minutes late. They're super, this air of busyness and timing's tight and we're ready to go. And there's some niceties. It's like, okay, let's go, go, go. And they say, I know we have an hour booked, but I only have 30 minutes. So hopefully we can get through this quickly and then we'll follow up with questions.
Okay.
Now, that immediately is a lot of information, just the words, not to mention how authentic is the handshake, is there eye contact, have they looked you up, do they pronounce your name properly, who they brought into the room with them, did they extend personal introductions, whatever. There's tons of information there. But in that first little timing signal, you learn a lot, which is that in many cases, they're actually letting you know right then and there that they're not going to spend more than 30 minutes unless they want to. And then when you get to the 30-minute mark, if they go over, you know that they're interested. And you can kind of evolve your dynamic in a way to be particularly customized to what they want to make sure they get out of this time that they're choosing to spend outside of expectations. So they're there now because they want to be, not because some calendar or assistant said they had to be. And that's when you can really kind of take a pause in the energy of the pitch and say, so what about this is really interesting news so far? Like, where do you see is the leading or most intriguing opportunity here? We want to make sure we get to your questions before you have to go. Are there any things that we haven't spent enough time on or haven't gotten to yet that you want to hear more about? And 90% of the time, you're going to be able to then follow the breadcrumb and adapt your remaining conversation in a way that's going to be the most potent and get you the results that you want. And again, another reminder, most of those meetings have one singular goal. And the singular goal of your pitch meeting, your first, is to get another meeting. Nobody's going to pull out a checkbook right then and there in the conference room and say, you guys are brilliant. We've been thinking about this problem. We've been waiting for the perfect company and team and product to come along. And here you go. How much do you need? No. the goal is to walk out of the meeting with a invitation to follow up for another meeting. And that's when things get to the next level. You've passed the pitch stage. Now you're into development, deeper learning, tuning, diligence, hopefully, on and on.
Hard and fast rules you have for yourself and the teams that you're coaching. Like what are some that are just kind of like this is baseline?
Yeah, so there are a few. First of all, the way you show up is really important. Be professional. You'd be surprised how many people just don't know this or think about it. And look, I'm a woman and I had a very particular mother, so I'm kind of particular about these things. And I often coach guys in their 20s and 30s on how to navigate this part. But basic stuff, like how you present, show up on time, make eye contact, have a strong handshake, be clean, be wearing clean clothes. Don't bring a ratty falling apart bag. You don't need to bring something really fancy and luxurious either, but present professionally. That's actually, I think, something that is unfortunately overlooked and sometimes yields judgments that cause obstacles that are really, really easy to avoid. I think that it's really important to think through what you're going to share in advance of a meeting. Some investors will want you to send the deck in advance, and think through, what do you want to send in advance? If they're still figuring out who is going to attend the meeting and you don't have a lot of confidence going into this with regard to the appetite of that investor, I would be cautious about sending an entire deck in advance of a meeting, or at least multiple days ahead of a meeting, because they might determine who's going to attend and how long the meeting is going to be based on an assessment of the opportunity via a deck you haven't had an opportunity to speak to. And it's very possible, if not likely, that the magic of your company and project are going to come through when you are in the room speaking to it. Don't shoot yourself in the foot before you even get in the door. At best, I recommend, if you're going to send something well in advance or while you're trying to secure the meeting, 5 or 6 slides. And then if it's a friendly, or you've already had a meeting, or you know who's already going to be there and you're within a few days, sending the full deck is sometimes okay, but I would make that decision very carefully. One that I see a surprising amount is people speaking in a way that is negative towards other people or organizations that are not in the room. That really does not do the founders or the teams any favors. Just in the last 48 hours, I heard a co-founder basically bash his lawyers over something that had to do with the timing on a strategic partnership. Not a good idea. He actually didn't know that I'm a lawyer at training when he did it first, which was, I didn't take it personally because I actually think lawyer jokes are funny most of the time, but I had to tell him after the fact, don't do that when you're in a meeting. You don't know who's there, and speaking ill of anybody is not a good idea. Also, in the same vein, don't breach confidences. Never say, I shouldn't be telling you this, but, or this is confidential information, but. You're signaling back to your very first question that you are not trustworthy with confidences. And if anything, an investor wants to know that they can trust both your judgment and your word. So that's really an important one. I also, it's kind of like running a marathon. These are stressful. They take time and energy, and can be a lot on your whole system to be doing a pitch, particularly in an intimidating environment with intimidating people. Go in like you're running a race. Be fed, be rested, be calm, be hydrated. Don't go, exhausted or in some compromised physical state. Go in ready to spend a good amount of time being clear and concise and communicative, and kind of presenting in a way that demonstrates the confidence with which you run your company. Super important. And then one other thing, if it works, I sometimes like recommending that CEOs, particularly more seasoned founding teams or leadership teams, open a meeting with, anything you want to make sure we get to during our time. I know it's limited, thank you, et cetera, but anything you want to make sure we get to, I think that that's also really important. And one other helpful opening question could also be just getting a sense of how familiar they are with your product or your industry, particularly in the blockchain space.
Why is that? That seems super practical for all teams. Why would you recommend that to just seasoned teams?
Well, if they're really nervous and really anxious, and this is their first pitch, and they don't have a lot of experience adapting a conversation to the needs of a room, in your first 5 minutes, finding out that you have to talk about something that you're not prepared to talk about can just derail your whole confidence zone.
Right.
So I discourage inviting requests that you're not totally ready to handle yet, and maybe save that for the end of the meeting.
Right.
Once you're a little bit relaxed and you've had a laugh or two and something screwed up with the AV and you're all kind of, over it. Is there anything we didn't get to that you want to get to? Great. But if you're just like trying to breathe and not fall apart in your first minute of your self-introduction, don't ask for more difficulty in the next.
Don't ask for curveballs, basically.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. Is there an optimal time for presentations?
It's great if you have an hour.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually a good amount of time for a presentation and a Q&A, and I think most are scheduled to be around an hour. Every startup doing a pitch prep process should be prepared to get what they need to get out within 15 minutes.
Okay.
So, have materials enough to cover an hour, including Q&A, maybe, 30 minutes tops of talking and plenty of time for answers, questions, whatever. But then, like what happened this morning, you're often going to have people come in the room and be like, oh, yeah, sorry, something more important than you came up. We only have 28 minutes now. And you need to not think, okay, I'm only going to make it 2/3 my way through my deck. No, you are ready. You have a 20-minute, 25-minute version down at most.
When they kind of surprise you with that shortening length, should you try to maximize the pitch, or should you sacrifice time for pitching for time for Q&A? Which part do you feel like is more important to getting that second meeting?
I think just being really clear about that 20%, make sure that there should be 3 or 4 slides that you need to show and you need to be able to talk to. And you want to make sure that no matter how long the meeting is, they walked out of the room having a little bit of a sense of you, having a little bit of a sense of the problem, how you're solving the problem, are you going to make money, is there going to be a valuable company as a result of your hard work, and are there more questions that we all want to have answered to further explore partnering, because an investment is really a partnership.
Do you recommend that teams have a short version of the deck and then a long version of the deck, or do they just have the slides memorized? It's for the 15-minute pitch, it's slides 1 to 8 and 20.
I like having a short and a long, but you just have to revise depending on the nature of the team. Some people can just say, we're just going to go to slides 4, 6, 9, and 12 and make it so. Some are much more comfortable having 2 versions. I think it really depends. I don't think it's too critical.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I think I'm going to end it there.
Awesome.
Cecily, thank you so much. This has been incredible. Yeah, this is amazing. Thank you so much for kind of sitting down and talking with us about this.
Absolutely. I really enjoy it. I love this work, and I'm always happy to speak with curious, fun people who are also supporting startups and doing cool stuff. So thank you for the opportunity, Zach. Great to collaborate.
Is there real quick, do you have a blog, or is there a place that people should be able to follow you on, or how should people look you up?
That's great. Actually LinkedIn is probably the best first step. Anybody can find me on LinkedIn. I'm easy, Cecily Mak at LinkedIn.
Okay.
And I don't use Twitter a whole lot anymore. I do have some Medium posts and other channels, but let's start with LinkedIn.
Primarily on LinkedIn. Okay, cool. Then I'll include the just a link to that on the thing where people can just kind of follow you and your updates and everything.
Awesome.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Absolutely. We'll talk again soon.
Have a good one.
Take care. You too. Bye.